Why did my electric bill look like I was running a data center out of my garage? That was the question burning through my mind as I stared at the statement. The numbers didn't lie, but they definitely didn't make sense either. I live alone. No kids. No massive TV wall or underground hot tub or high-powered koi pond filter system. Just a small solar-powered house tucked at the end of a quiet suburban loop with energy-efficient everything and the kind of routine that makes utility companies bored. My biggest electrical splurge was a toaster with a bagel setting. And yet, somehow, I was being billed like I was hosting late-night raves for hundreds of sweaty, glow-stick-waving dancers. I went through everything, checked the thermostat logs, verified my appliances, even unplugged the spare fridge in the garage just to be safe. Still, the numbers didn't drop. That's when I started looking outside. And that's when I saw it. An orange extension cord, thick, brazen, winding out from the side of my house like a snake trying to slither away before being noticed. It disappeared into a neat row of hedge bushes that lined the narrow walkway, separating my property from my neighbors. I followed it, barefoot, my pulse picking up with every step. As I rounded the hedge, I heard the hum of a machine. Then I saw her. Karen, the HOA president, wearing oversized sunglasses, a floral robe, and a wide straw hat that looked like it had been stolen from a discount garden center. She was lounging on a zero-gravity chair with a glass of lemonade in one hand, and in the other, she was calmly plugging my extension cord into a tower of devices on her patio. A massive oscillating fan, a radiant heater, a glowing foot spa, and, bizarrely, a bug zapper with what looked like Bluetooth speakers attached. She had transformed her deck into a makeshift luxury spa, and she was powering it with my electricity. I didn't say a word. I just stood there, heart pounding, watching her pretend that my outlet was her personal utility gift from the heavens. She didn't flinch, didn't glance, didn't seem to care. Eventually, I turned around and walked back the way I came. I wasn't the kind of guy to blow up over something without having all the facts. But in that moment, I knew one thing for certain. This wasn't over. Later that night, I sat on my porch with a glass of iced tea and stared at the corner of the yard where the cord had been. It was gone now, coiled back up like a criminal hiding the evidence. But the damage was done. My outlet had been hijacked. My trust violated. Karen, the self-appointed queen of the HOA, had crossed a line, not with a bang, but with a plug. And that meant one thing. I was going to find out just how deep this rabbit hole went. The next morning, I didn't go straight to confrontation. I'm not built that way. Instead, I opened the dusty HOA handbook tucked into the bottom drawer of my kitchen desk. You know, the one we all get when we move in and immediately forget exists until someone reports your recycling bin for being visibly disheveled. I flipped through the usual nonsense. Acceptable grass height, mailbox standards, which fonts were allowed on house number plaques. And then, finally, I found it. Section 4.3.2. Personal property and utility use. It was right there, black and white. No resident shall use, tamper with, or access another resident's utility services or connections without explicit, documented consent. Well, I hadn't given Karen consent. In fact, I hadn't even given her conversation. I printed the section out, highlighted it like I was preparing a college thesis, and taped it right on her front door. 12 hours later, I found it stuffed in my mailbox. Crumpled, torn in one corner, and scribbled with a message in sharp, looping cursive. "Lighten up, it's just a little juice." I laughed. I actually laughed out loud in my driveway. A little juice. She was pulling more wattage than my entire air conditioning system, and she was doing it daily. This wasn't some emergency charge for her phone. This was coordinated, intentional. I went back inside and opened my smart home dashboard. Power logs didn't lie. Every day, Between 12:45 p.m. and 6 p.m., there was a surge. A spike so consistent, it could have been scheduled by a Swiss train conductor. That's when I noticed something else. There were always multiple spikes. It wasn't one device. It was several, turning on and off, probably based on what she needed for her afternoon rituals. Fans, heat lamps, probably a mini fridge and a smoothie blender too. And here's the kicker. This woman, Karen, our HOA monarch, was the same person who had once fined a neighbor for having too many wind chimes because they disturbed the peace. The same woman who had written me a violation letter last fall because I had a pumpkin on my porch past Thanksgiving. Not carved, just a pumpkin. Now she was siphoning electricity like a power-hungry vampire in Lululemon leggings, and I was the poor fool footing the bill. So I made a decision. No more warnings, no more highlighted handbook quotes. I was done playing defense. From that moment forward, it was game on. There's a certain kind of arrogance that doesn't just cross boundaries. It dances on them in flip-flops while sipping iced tea. That's the level Karen was operating on. And I needed proof. Not for revenge. Not even for HOA leverage. I needed it because, deep down, I knew that unless I gathered evidence of what she was doing, she'd twist everything around and turn herself into the victim. That's how people like her operate. They exploit ambiguity. They rely on hearsay and loopholes. But numbers, timelines, tangible behavior, documented and undeniable, that's how you beat a professional manipulator. So I started logging everything. Power surges matched to time, duration of peak loads. I traced the curve of each spike like I was reading a lie detector test. Every time she plugged into my outlet, my meter didn't just rise, it sang. I marked down each spike, every time her little devices hummed to life. And I started noticing patterns. Mondays were always light, probably yoga night. But Tuesdays through Fridays, full power cycles. From 1 o'clock sharp, just after lunch, all the way into the early evening, her deck was a mini resort running off my grid. Her fan was set to maximum oscillation. There was a heater that buzzed like a jet engine. And more than once, I spotted steam curling upward from a contraption that looked suspiciously like a portable sauna tent. She was living better in my backyard than most people do at a day spa. At my expense. The real eye-opener was the blender. I didn't hear it at first. I felt it. A low, grumbling vibration that tickled the windows. I followed the sensation like a bloodhound, and sure enough, there it was. Karen, behind her patio railing, pouring a mix of what looked like kale, mango, and defiance into a commercial-grade blender. Her husband was reclining nearby with earbuds in, completely unbothered. The cord snaked from the base of the machine across her lawn, under the fence, and into my exterior outlet. Just bold. Reckless. Like she had no idea there were consequences in the world. Or maybe, more accurately, she was so used to not facing them, she stopped believing they existed. And that's when I knew I couldn't just cut her off and be done with it. If I did that, she'd play dumb. Pretend it never happened. Or worse, report me to the HOA for tampering with community access points. I needed her caught in her own act. I needed someone with authority to see exactly what she was doing, and have no way to deny it. And as luck would have it, the city had just launched a new initiative that allowed residents to request home energy audits and inspections. Designed to promote transparency and prevent utility misuse, the pamphlet said. Karen must have missed that memo. I didn't. The city inspector showed up in a grey van with the logo of the Utility Commission printed on the side. Quiet guy, serious demeanour, clipboard always within arm's reach. I greeted him at the curb, walked him around to the outlet, and laid out the facts like puzzle pieces. I showed him the power usage logs, the daily spikes, the total kilowatt draw. I walked him through my standard usage profile and compared it to the recent anomalies. He nodded slowly, asked a few technical questions, and then said something that made my day. "Do you mind if I check the neighbor's side?" I told him to go right ahead. From my porch, I watched it unfold. He strolled over casually, clipboard in hand, and knocked on Karen's door. She answered in full, "I'm the boss" mode, chin up, eyes narrow, already annoyed that someone had dared to interrupt her reign. The conversation started normal enough. I could see her pointing toward the patio, gesturing with large, sweeping motions like she was giving a tour of Versailles. But when the inspector pointed toward the cord, something changed. Her hands stopped moving. Her shoulders stiffened. Then she stepped in closer, as if proximity alone could convince him to look the other way. I watched her lips move faster, like she was scrambling to spin the situation into something innocent. The inspector didn't flinch. He jotted something down, shook his head, and handed her a yellow warning tag. She didn't take it well. She turned toward my house, lips pursed so tightly they practically disappeared, and glared like she'd been personally betrayed. The inspector left without much ceremony. No drama, just a gentle, "We'll be following up." But I knew that wasn't the end. With Karen, embarrassment isn't an ending. It's a spark. By sundown, I had my answer. Every single neighbor on our street had received a flyer in their mailbox. Black and white, typed in bold font, printed on what looked like stolen office paper. The headline read, "Is your neighbor recording you? What you need to know." Below that was a grainy photo of my side yard, taken from what must have been a bad angle through her kitchen blinds, followed by a list of vague accusations about invasive surveillance, energy paranoia, and something called electrical aggression, which I'm still not convinced is a real term. She warned that certain individuals were weaponizing the neighborhood's peaceful energy culture and threatening the unity of the block. Unity. The same woman who fined people for garden gnomes and tried to get a neighbor evicted for planting wildflowers was now worried about unity. I could have laughed if I hadn't known how dangerous her kind of fake outrage could be. She wasn't just trying to discredit me. She was trying to rewrite the narrative. And if I didn't act fast, I'd be stuck as the villain in a story she'd already started telling. But here's the thing about facts. They may be slow. They may be boring. But when they catch up, they hit like a freight train. Karen had tried to fry me with the heat from my own outlet, but she had no idea how much heat was about to come her way. The next few days felt like living under a personal weather system, one that stormed only over my house. 5 official notices, all from the HOA, all signed with the same looping, arrogant signature. Karen P. Tremblay, President. The first one accused me of improper trash bin storage. Apparently, placing the bin 3 feet from the curb instead of precisely 2.5 was now a cardinal sin. The second notice claimed my front hedges were encroaching by approximately 3.5 inches onto the sidewalk, as if someone had measured them with a laser scope. The third one was particularly insulting. Violation of mailbox standards due to an unapproved decorative magnet that featured a cartoon cat holding a fish. That magnet had been there for 3 years, gifted to me by my niece, and no one had ever complained, until now. The fourth was almost impressive in its creativity. Reflective surface violation, it said, claiming that the afternoon sun bouncing off my solar panels was a danger to pedestrian eyesight. And the fifth? Failure to maintain aesthetic conformity of roofline accessories, which, as far as I could tell, meant my weather vane was too whimsical. I didn't even remember owning a weather vane. Karen had gone nuclear. She was using every line in the HOA handbook as a weapon, cherry-picking obscure rules, exaggerating minor quirks, and fabricating the rest. It was a blitz, not meant to correct anything, but to bury me in paperwork, force me to defend my right to exist in my own home. She didn't want compliance. She wanted capitulation. But instead of panicking, I documented everything. I photographed my bins, my mailbox, my hedges. I printed time-stamped weather reports to show the solar glare didn't even hit the street. And I started building a dossier, because I knew exactly where this was heading. And I wasn't alone. Neighbors I barely knew started waving at me, cautiously at first, then with a kind of hesitant solidarity. A few approached me during morning walks, quiet, low-voiced conversations that started with, "I heard what she's doing to you," and ended with, "She fined me for parking too close to my own garage last fall." Karen had ruled this place with a sugar-coated fist for years. People were too busy, too tired, or too scared to push back. But now, someone had become a visible target, and people were watching how I responded. Then came the announcement. The annual summer block party, hosted by the HOA, funded through community generosity, and scheduled, of course, to be held in Karen's backyard. The flyer promised live music, cold drinks, lawn games, and a surprise light show, all apparently made possible by a cooperative spirit and shared resources from generous neighbors. It didn't take a genius to know who she meant. She was planning to plug into my outlet again. Not for a fan or a blender, but for an entire event. That morning I prepared. I didn't make a scene. I didn't post anything online. I didn't even call her out. I simply disabled the outlet. Not just flipped a breaker, no. I physically disconnected the power routing inside my panel box and redirected the wiring to a new secured junction that couldn't be accessed from the exterior. The outlet still looked live. The light next to it still blinked green, but it was dead. As lifeless as Karen's concept of boundaries. By 2 p.m., I was sitting on my porch, sipping iced tea, when I heard the familiar thump of bass start up across the fence. Karen's backyard was already filling up with people, neighbors, their kids, a few teenagers clearly bribed with soda and snacks. There was a margarita machine humming in anticipation, a rented sound system on the deck, fairy lights strung across her awning, and a fold-out table sagging under bowls of chips and tubs of dip. She had gone all out, and she had done it expecting me to stay quiet. Then came the moment of truth. A young guy, probably someone she'd hired off an app, walked over to the outlet on my property line, plugged in a 3-way splitter, and flipped the switch. Nothing. He checked the cord, tapped the plug, tried again. Still nothing. A beat passed. Karen emerged from behind the snack table, clapping her hands like a wedding planner, then stopped cold when she saw him shrug. She marched over, her heels stabbing the grass, and began whisper shouting like someone trying to stay polite at church. I couldn't hear the words, but I could guess. Her face flushed red. She looked at my house. I raised my glass and gave her the smallest nod I could manage without laughing. A few minutes later, the music stopped. The crowd murmured. Someone made a joke about it being the shortest party ever. The kids began chasing each other instead of dancing. And Karen. She disappeared inside, leaving her husband to apologize and distribute melting popsicles. But that wasn't the end. The next morning, I found a manila envelope on my doorstep. No return address. No markings. Inside were photocopies, emails, meeting minutes, and receipts. I scanned the first page and felt my breath catch. These weren't random. They were internal HOA documents. Emails from Karen to the board discussing strategic enforcement against uncooperative residents. Copies of payment approvals where HOA funds had gone toward beautification landscaping. Yet all the invoices listed her address. Meeting minutes where votes had allegedly passed, but the sign-in sheets showed half the board absent. She was approving her own projects, rubber stamping reimbursements, and using the HOA as her personal ATM. And whoever sent this to me had clearly had enough. There was one line that stood out more than any other. A message Karen had written to a board member after our first confrontation. Let Mason's outlet teach him some humility. That's when everything clicked. She wasn't just stealing power. She was trying to make an example out of me, to remind everyone what happened if you challenged her crown. But she had underestimated the one thing that always outlasts a tyrant: paperwork. Real, cold, unemotional proof. With it, I wasn't just a guy with a grudge anymore. I was holding a time bomb, and it was ticking straight toward her throne. 2 weeks before the next HOA meeting, I filed everything into a binder so thick it could be used as a weapon. I labeled every tab, cross-referenced each page, and color-coded the worst infractions in red. It wasn't just the proof that Karen had been misusing HOA funds. It was a full blueprint of how she operated. Every forged vote, every self-approved reimbursement, every HOA fine that had no basis in the actual bylaws. It was a roadmap of manipulation, and for the first time, I realized she hadn't just been playing dirty with me. She'd been doing it for years, quietly, consistently, with the polished smile of someone who thought she'd never be caught. The more I read, the more I saw the pattern. She targeted those who were new, those who kept to themselves, those who wouldn't push back. She thrived on silence, using it as a shield to slip just below the radar. And now that silence was over. The meeting took place on a warm Thursday evening inside the community clubhouse, a beige-walled space that usually hosted yoga nights and birthday rentals. But tonight, every folding chair was taken. People who hadn't attended an HOA meeting in years had shown up. Some brought their kids. Some brought lawn chairs. Everyone brought tension. Karen walked in wearing her signature red blazer, clipboard clutched like a gavel, and offered her usual smile. Tight, smug, and utterly convinced that the world still bent in her direction. She opened the meeting with a speech about neighborly cooperation, civic pride, and the importance of maintaining order during times of unrest. I waited. I let her talk. I let her run through her checklist, announce a new flagpole height restriction, and ramble on about an upcoming Beautify the Block initiative. Then she opened the floor to comments. I stood up slowly, holding the binder under one arm. My voice was calm. My hands didn't shake. I walked to the front table and handed copies of the documents to each board member, then to Karen. Her smile twitched. Her eyes narrowed, scanning the first few pages like she was trying to read them upside down. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse. I simply said, "These documents came into my possession recently. They concern the misuse of HOA authority, misappropriation of funds, and multiple procedural violations that affect every homeowner in this room." And then I stepped aside. The room went silent. People flipped through the pages. Whispers started. One woman gasped when she reached the part about Karen billing the HOA for a personal backyard fire pit installation under the label Emergency Drainage Solution. Someone else cursed softly when they read the email about teaching Mason a lesson. Karen tried to speak. She started with, "This is taken out of context," then pivoted to, "These are confidential," then stumbled into, "It's a personal attack against my leadership." But the tide had already turned. A neighbor, Mike, 2 doors down, stood up and asked, "Is it true you paid yourself to redo your own lawn?" Karen didn't answer. Another neighbor, a quiet man named Jacob, who'd never spoken at any meeting I'd ever seen, raised his hand and said, "I got fined for painting my shutters blue. She told me it violated the community palette. Is that even a thing?" Someone else asked, "Did we vote on any of these reimbursements?" The murmurs became voices. The voices became outrage. And then came the motion. Someone from the back row stood up and called for an emergency vote to suspend Karen pending a full audit. It wasn't even on the agenda, but people raised their hands, one by one, until the entire room looked like a sea of arms. Karen's jaw dropped. She protested, citing procedural irregularities. but the board overruled her. The suspension passed, effective immediately. She stormed out before the meeting ended. That night, the neighborhood message board lit up. The files had been uploaded anonymously. People shared their own stories. Fines for things they never did. Citations with no follow-up. Decisions that were allegedly made in secret. The mask had fallen off, and what people saw underneath wasn't just petty control. It was systematic abuse. But the best part came the next morning. A simple sign taped to the HOA bulletin board. Special election, HOA president, 2-week notice. In black and white, Karen's kingdom had just been dismantled. 2 weeks passed in a blur of preparation, but I didn't campaign. I didn't knock on doors or send out flyers. I didn't have to. The neighbors already knew the truth. When the votes were counted, I wasn't the new president. That honor went to Cheryl, a retired school librarian with no tolerance for drama and a deep love of rules. But I was elected compliance officer, unanimously. Karen didn't show up to the election. Her lawn remained untouched. The red blazer was nowhere to be seen, and her beloved clipboard never resurfaced. For the first time in months, the air in the neighborhood felt breathable again. A few days later, just before sunset, my doorbell rang. I opened the door, and there she was. Karen. No sunglasses, no makeup, no clipboard, just a white envelope in her hand and a tired look in her eyes. She held out the envelope and said, "It's the apology letter, from the court. I figured I'd bring it to you myself." I took it. She nodded, turned to leave. But before she could step off the porch, I said, "If you ever touch my outlet again, I'm wiring it to a cattle prod." She paused, almost smiled, then walked away without saying a word. The silence that followed was different. Not empty, not awkward, peaceful. Karen's house went up for sale 3 weeks later. The sign read, "Motivated Seller." Rumor was she'd moved in with her sister across town. The new couple that bought the place were friendly, quiet, and brought over cookies on their second day. The husband asked about the sealed box around my outdoor outlet. I told him, "It's a reminder of what happens when you forget boundaries." He laughed, said he got the message loud and clear. In the months that followed, the HOA ran like it was supposed to. Meetings were short, decisions were fair, and the rulebook was updated to prevent any future Karen from ever grabbing power the same way again. We even passed a new clause, unofficially known as the Karen provision, requiring full transparency for all board decisions, mandatory vote logs, and strict penalties for unauthorized use of personal utilities. It passed without a single objection. My outlet, once the spark that started a war, now sat behind a locked, reinforced cover with a bright red warning sticker. It wasn't just an electrical fixture anymore. It was a monument, a symbol of what happens when someone underestimates the quiet guy with the facts and the will to stand his ground. Sometimes justice doesn't come in a grand speech or a courtroom showdown. Sometimes it comes in a slow, steady tide that rises until even the tallest castle on the beach is underwater. Karen built hers high. But in the end, she forgot that all power, electrical or otherwise, has limits. And when you keep plugging in where you shouldn't, eventually, something blows.